The morning erupted into chaos with a scream that sliced through the stillness, jolting me from my coffee on the porch where I'd been watching the sunrise paint the sky in soft oranges and pinks. It wasn't just any scream, but the kind you'd hear in a slasher flick, high-pitched and dripping with the terror of someone realizing they'd royally screwed up. I whipped my head around just in time to catch a whirlwind of yoga mats, water bottles, and spandex-clad bodies spilling out of my barn. A stampede led by none other than Alina Hawthorne, the HOA's self-anointed queen. Her pristine blonde bob now a sweaty tangle as she fled my 140-pound guard dog, Brutus, who bounded after them with the gleeful abandon of an overgrown puppy. Behind her, a woman in neon leggings tripped over a hay bale, face planting into the dirt, while another fumbled her kombucha bottle, shattering it and spraying fermented tea like a geyser. And then, as if the universe had a twisted sense of humor, Alina's foot snagged a feed bucket, launching her face first into a fresh pile of manure, a poetic justice so perfect I nearly spilled my coffee laughing. It all traced back to a week earlier when I'd first noticed something off. My barn, usually a sanctuary of wood, hay, and the faint musk of cows, had taken on a new scent, something floral and artificial like lavender or sage gone wrong, a clue that didn't belong on a working farm. Then came the music, a soft, meditative hum drifting from inside, the kind you'd expect in a spa, not a barn, so I strode over, half expecting some lost influencer staging a photo shoot, only to fling open the doors and find 12 people in matching yoga gear, stretching in unison with Alina at the helm, arms outstretched like a guru leading a breathing exercise. She didn't even flinch when she saw me, just flashed that fake customer service smile and chirped. "Oh, you must be wondering about the schedule change. We had to move our community yoga class from the clubhouse due to maintenance, and your barn was the perfect space. You're on the community property list, so we assumed you wouldn't mind." As if I'd ever agreed to such a thing, I blinked, waiting for the punchline, and said, "My what?" She repeated it, her tone turning condescending. "The community property list, we track spaces for group activities, and since your barn's within HOA jurisdiction." Cut her off. "No, it's not." But she just smiled wider, unfazed by facts. I'd bought this land long before the HOA existed, never signing their absurd agreements, but Alina wasn't one to let reality derail her plans. She clasped her manicured hands and said, "Well, that's up for discussion," though it absolutely was. Stepping inside, I growled, "This isn't up for discussion, this is private property, get out," and a gasp rippled from the back like I'd just insulted yoga itself. Alina tapped her nails together and cooed, "We've booked the space for 6 weeks, so I think we should compromise." But I wasn't in the mood for her games. "Let me make this clear," I said, enunciating every word. "If I find anyone in my barn again, I'm letting my dogs out." Her expression didn't shift, but a flicker of doubt crossed her eyes. She wasn't used to defiance, yet instead of arguing, she gave a tight-lipped smile, gathered her mat, and announced to her flock, "We'll discuss this at the next HOA meeting," strutting out like she'd done me a favor. I should have known that was just the opening salvo in a war I didn't ask for. The next morning, they were back, like cockroaches after a light flickers off, the scent of sage thicker than ever, curling through the air as I stepped outside, my coffee still warm in my hand, only to spot candles flickering inside my barn, turning it into some kind of hippie shrine that make a cult blush. I didn't bother with words this time. No point in arguing with Alina's brand of entitlement. So I marched straight back to the house, whistled sharp and loud, and watched Brutus, Fang, and Daisy come tearing around the corner, tails wagging like they'd just won the lottery. I barely had to nod toward the barn before they bolted, a trio of chaos unleashed with glee. The doors flew open, and Alina's dignified shriek was the first sound to hit me, followed by the glorious sight of her sprinting for daylight, her overpriced yoga mat abandoned as my dogs herded the HOA flock with barking enthusiasm. Some tried climbing the fence, others flailed like newborn giraffes, and Brutus, the fastest, stayed hot on Alina's heels until she tripped, rolled, and splatted into that manure pile, a masterpiece of karmic timing I couldn't have scripted better. I stood there, arms crossed, as the chaos unfolded. Yoga mats flew, a water bottle bounced off a post, and one woman's shriek hit a pitch that could have summoned bats, until the last of them scattered, leaving my barn quiet again, save for the dogs panting happily at my feet. That night, I pulled the footage from my security cameras, every glorious second of it, and uploaded it online with the title HOA Meets Karma Feet. Angry guard dogs, grinning as it racked up views by morning. Eleanor wasn't just mad. She was a volcano ready to erupt. And the HOA called an emergency meeting I wasn't invited to, but I didn't need an RSVP to know they were plotting revenge. Sure enough, a notice appeared on my door that afternoon, claiming my fence was 1 inch too tall, demanding replacement or a $500 fine, followed by another citing my mailboxes, wrong color. By week's end, I'd collected $2,000 in fines for infractions so petty they'd make a toddler's tantrum look reasonable. It was clear what they were doing. No direct confrontation, just a slow drown in paperwork and bureaucracy, hopping I'd cave. But they'd picked the wrong guy to mess with, and my dogs, lounging at my feet with wagging tails, were ready for round 2. The next morning, I woke to a sound I'd never heard on my land. Chanting, not birds or cows, but human voices humming in eerie unison, like they were conjuring a ghost. I threw on my boots, grabbed my coffee, and stepped onto the porch to find the HOA in full force, picketing my driveway with signs like "No dogs, no drama, just yoga, and inner peace, not inner beasts." A protest so twee it could have been ripped from a self-help seminar. Eleanor stood at the center, arms crossed, radiating smugness as she declared it a peaceful demonstration for my hostility toward their wellness initiative. I took a slow sip of coffee and asked, "What the hell is this?" And she lifted her chin, saying, "Since you've chosen aggression, we're expressing our concerns non-violently," as if trespassing and now picketing my land made sense. "You trespassed, got chased off, and now you're protesting my property." I said, incredulous, but she just smiled, claiming open dialogue was key. I stared at them, they stared back, and I decided words were overrated. I turned, cranked my outdoor speakers to max, and let loose a blast of old-school country music, banjos and all, loud enough to wake the dead. The twang of banjos and screech of fiddles erupted from my speakers, songs about trucks and heartbreak so loud they rattled the porch boards, and I leaned against the railing, coffee in hand, watching the HOA's peaceful demonstration crumble like a house of cards in a windstorm. Within 6 minutes, the picket line buckled, the group scattering as the second song's chorus kicked in, leaving Eleanor to cling to her dignity like a captain on a sinking ship. She stood her ground, arms crossed, glaring through the sonic assault. But when the third track unleashed a yodeling solo so aggressive it could have spooked a bull, even she faltered. Her sign hit the dirt, and she retreated, muttering curses I couldn't hear over the music, her white flag moment as satisfying as the dog's barn chase. I cut the speakers and savored the silence, figuring that'd be the end of it, but Eleanor's pettiness ran deeper than I'd guessed. That evening a fine arrived, $250 for unauthorized noise disturbance, followed by 2 more, one for my fence being a shade too dark, another for my mailbox clashing with the community aesthetic, piling my fines over $2,000 by week's end, a paper war meant to bury me, but they weren't done yet. Someone reported my farm as an illegal junkyard, triggering a surprise visit from a county inspector who rolled up, clipboard in hand, took one look at my land, cows grazing, barn standing, and muttered, "This is a farm," before shooting me an exasperated glance and leaving, clearly annoyed at the hoax. Then the next morning, I caught an HOA minion skulking near my barn, snapping photos with a notepad, bolting when I stepped outside like he'd been caught raiding a vault. That was the last straw. The gloves were off, and I wasn't playing defense anymore. I installed security cameras, motion-activated sprinklers along the fence, and an automated speaker blasting cow moos at trespassers, turning my property into a fortress of petty revenge. The first night, a camera caught an HOA lackey creeping too close. Sprinklers fired, soaking him head to toe, and he screamed like he'd been doused in acid, stumbling into my electric fence with a jolt just strong enough to make him rethink his life. I laughed so hard I nearly choked, edited the footage into a highlight reel, sprays, trips, startled yelps to cow sounds, and uploaded it as HOA versus security system. Who wins? Racking up more views than the dog video by morning. It was war now, both sides digging in, and I decided to flip the script. If they could weaponize rules, so could I. So I pored over the HOA bylaws, wadding through pages of nonsense until I struck gold. A clause stating community events needed approval from at least 3 board members, or they were unapproved and technically trespassing, a loophole I could wield like a sledgehammer. I waited for their next move, and sure enough, Saturday rolled around with a leaner's yoga crew setting up in a new spot on neighborhood land. Mats unrolled, candles lit, and I sprang into action, calling the HOA treasurer and secretary, two weary souls fed up with a leaner's tyranny, who confirmed they hadn't approved the event. Then I dialed the county, reporting an unauthorized gathering, and 20 minutes later, a sheriff's cruiser pulled up. I wasn't there to see it, but word spread fast. HOA members scattered like roaches, a leaner arguing in vain as the sheriff cited their own rules against them, issuing a $500 fine and a warning for violating policy. That night she stood just beyond my sprinklers, glaring daggers, and snapped, "You think this is funny?" I sipped my coffee and grinned, little bit, yeah. Eleanor's glare could have melted steel as she stood there, just out of sprinkler range, her pristine nails pointing at me like a loaded gun while she spat. "You may have won this round, but this isn't over," her voice sharp with the venom of a woman scorned. I leaned against the porch rail, coffee in hand, and smirked. "I hope not. I'm having way too much fun," watching Brutus pant happily at my feet as she stormed off, muttering about legal action that I knew was a bluff. She was running out of moves, and we both felt it, but I wasn't about to let my guard down. The final showdown didn't come with sirens or showdowns. It crept in quietly, a bright, garish flyer taped to my mailbox, stapled to my gate, even fluttering from a tree, screaming, "Reclaim the Barn" event. Join the HOA in restoring our community space, Saturday 10 a.m., with a photo of my barn like it was some public monument. I stared at it, incredulous, as the audacity sank in. They weren't just trespassing anymore, they were claiming my land outright, and I knew this was their last desperate gambit. I spent the next 2 days prepping, turning my property into a battlefield of my own design, ensuring that when they marched in, they'd regret every step. By Saturday morning, I was ready, boots on, coffee brewing, and a grin I couldn't shake. They arrived like a parade of entitlement, yoga mats and folding chairs in tow, a refreshment table groaning under fruit platters and tea pitchers. Eleanor swept in last, a vision in a white tracksuit, radiating the smug confidence of someone who'd never faced real consequences, stepping onto my land like she'd already won and raising her arms to declare, "Today, we reclaim what belongs to the community." I let them settle in, unroll their mats, start their breathing exercises, savoring the calm before the storm. Then I made my move, riding out on Maverick, my old horse, in my best cowboy hat and boots, letting the sight sink in as murmurs rippled through the group. Eleanor crossed her arms, smirking like she'd already outplayed me, and said, "You can't stop us, this is a community-approved event." But I pulled a paper from my jacket, unfolding it slow and deliberate, and replied, "Actually, no, according to your bylaws, an event needs 3 board members' approval. As of yesterday, 2 of them resigned, leaving you alone, which means this isn't approved at all." Her face went pale, her voice stuttering. "That's ridiculous. I'm the president. I have authority." I grinned wider. "Not without a board, you don't," and waved toward my driveway where my next surprise rolled in. 2 figures stepped forward, my lawyer, cool and collected, and a county official, clipboard in hand. The HOA crowd froze, whispers turning to silence as the official cleared his throat and said, "We've received complaints about unauthorized events on private property. After reviewing records, this land isn't and never was under HOA jurisdiction. Any fines against Mr. Dawson are invalid." A gasp cut the air, a teacup hit the ground, and a leaner sputtered, "That's impossible." My lawyer adjusted his tie and smiled. "Oh, it's very possible. The property lines were redrawn over a decade ago before the HOA existed. This land. Never been yours, but you've been acting like it is, which means all your actions here are under review." The official nodded, adding, "Including attempts to seize this property for public use." And chaos erupted. HOA members backed away, some pulling out phones, probably lawyering up, while Eleanor's dream of victory crumbled in real time, her reign teetering on the edge of collapse. The air crackled with tension as the county official's words sank in, the HOA crowd unraveling like a cheap sweater. Some edged away, clutching yoga mats like life preservers, while others whispered furiously into phones, no doubt scrambling for legal cover, but Eleanor stood rooted, her white tracksuit pristine against the chaos, her face a mask of disbelief twisting into defiance. "This is absurd." She snapped, her voice pitching higher as she waved at my barn. "We have rules, regulations. This land's been part of the community for years." My lawyer didn't flinch, just adjusted his tie with a calm smile and said, "No, it hasn't, and if you keep pushing, you're looking at a lawsuit for harassment and fraud." His words landing like a gut punch that drained the last of her color from red to ghostly white. Her hands clenched at her sides, nails digging into her palms, and for a moment I thought she'd argue, scream, stomp, anything. But the murmurs around her grew louder, the crowd's faith in her fraying, and then the killing blow came from within. An older woman, one of the few HOA members I didn't outright loathe, stepped forward, her voice trembling as she said, "You lied to us, Alina. You told us we had rights to this land, made us fine him, harass him, and now it's all fake." Alina's mouth opened, but nothing came out. She spun, searching for support, but the eyes that once followed her blindly now turned away, doubt and anger replacing loyalty. That was it, the dam broke, and the vote to oust her happened right there, a chaotic show of hands that wasn't even close. The remaining HOA members, shell-shocked and scrambling to save face, turned to me with apologies tumbling out, nervous laughs, promises to make peace. But I cut through their chatter, voice flat and firm. "If I ever see another yoga mat near my barn, I'm getting more dogs," and I wasn't joking. They nodded fast, some chuckling like it was a punchline, though my stare made it clear it wasn't. They packed up in record time, folding chairs clattering, fruit platters abandoned as they fled, leaving my land empty again by sunset. Alina didn't go quietly, though. I spotted her a week later, stiff and sour-faced, walking down the street, avoiding my gaze like I was a ghost she'd rather forget, her power stripped, her control shattered, and her reign over me dead and buried. The fines vanished after that, the harassment dried up, and I leaned back on my porch one afternoon. A cold drink in hand, Brutus, Fang, and Daisy sprawled at my feet, letting out a long, satisfied sigh. Peace at last, or so I thought, because with Alina you never knew what lingered around the corner. It started as a petty trespass, a yoga class I hadn't signed up for, but it ballooned into a war of wills. Her with her bylaws and fines, me with my dogs and sprinklers. And in the end, I'd turned her own rules against her, toppling her empire with a loophole and a horse ride. The neighborhood buzzed about it for weeks, my barn chase video still racking up views, kids daring each other to sneak near the fence only to bolt at the first move from my speakers. I didn't care about the fame, just the quiet, the victory of sipping my coffee without some spandex army invading my space. And as the sun dipped low, painting the sky in hues of fire, I patted Brutus's head, grinning at how a little chaos had won me back my land and a whole lot more. The days after Alina's fall slid into a rhythm I hadn't felt in months. Mornings started with the soft lowing of cows, not the hum of yoga chants, and my coffee stayed hot while I watched the sunrise from a porch free of picket signs or smug HOA faces. The barn stood quiet, its doors shut tight, the only scents drifting out the familiar musk of hay and wood, no trace of sage or lavender to sour the air. The neighborhood settled too. Folks nodded at me as they passed, some with a wary respect, others with grins that said they'd secretly cheered my rebellion. And the HOA, now led by quieter souls like Mr. Patterson from the last story, scrapped the nonsense rules, leaving my mailbox's color and fence height blissfully unjudged. It was almost too good to be true, and part of me kept waiting for the other shoe to drop, for Alina to slink back with some new scheme. Because if I'd learned anything, it was that she didn't lose gracefully. Sure enough, a week after her street-side sulk, I found a letter in my mailbox. Not an HOA fine this time, but a crisp envelope from a law firm, the kind that screams expensive trouble. I tore it open, scanning the legalese, and there it was. Alina was suing me for emotional distress and defamation over the viral videos, claiming my dogs and sprinklers had humiliated her beyond repair. I laughed so hard Brutus barked, thinking it was a game. The lawsuit was a stretch, even for her $50,000 in damages for a manure tumble and some wet yoga pants. But it was classic Alina, grasping at straws to claw back control, and I wasn't about to let it rattle me. I called my lawyer, the same guy who dismantled her community event, with a smile, and he chuckled when I read him the claims, saying, "She's got no case, private property, clear trespass, and those videos are fair game. I'll handle it." He filed a counterclaim the next day. Harassment, intentional infliction of distress and legal fees, turning her petty jab into a boomerang she'd regret throwing. I didn't want her money, just her to back off, and as the legal gears churned, I kept my routine, riding Maverick around the property, tweaking the sprinklers for fun, letting the dogs roam with their tails high. Life felt good, defiant mine. Word spread fast. Neighbors stopped by with beers and gossip. One saying he'd seen a leaner at the grocery store, snapping at a cashier, her polish cracking under the weight of her lost throne. And I couldn't help but grin, picturing her stewing while my land stayed free. Then came the deposition notice. A leaner wanted me in a stuffy office, grilled under oath, probably hoping to trip me up. But my lawyer prepped me like a general, and when the day arrived, I walked in calm, boots polished, ready to bury her nonsense. She sat across the table, eyes blazing, her attorney asking about the dogs, the sprinklers, the videos like they were war crimes, and I answered straight. They trespassed. I protected my property. End of story. Her lawyer pushed, "Didn't you intend to humiliate her?" And I leaned back, smirking. Nope, just wanted my barn back. The manure was her own bad luck. Eleanor's face twitched, her composure slipping, and by the end, her attorney looked deflated, knowing they'd overreached. My lawyer sealed it with security footage and bylaws, proving her every move was illegal, and as we left, I caught her glare, furious, powerless, and knew this was her last gasp, a battle she'd already lost but couldn't admit. The deposition was the beginning of the end. Eleanor's lawsuit unraveled faster than a moth-eaten scarf, her attorney's questions bouncing off me like pebbles off a tank. And by the time we walked out, her glare was a mix of rage and resignation, a woman watching her last card slip through her fingers. My lawyer didn't let up, filing motions to dismiss her claims while pushing our counterclaim hard. Every HOA fine, every trespass, every petty violation she'd thrown at me now evidence of her harassment. And within weeks, the judge tossed her case, citing lack of merit in a ruling so dry it might have bored her to tears. Our counterclaim lingered, a quiet threat, but I told him to hold off on pressing it. I didn't need her broke, just gone, and the legal smackdown seemed to do the trick. The neighborhood buzzed with the fallout. Folks swapped stories over fences about Eleanor's decline, how she'd stopped showing up to HOA meetings, her tracksuit swapped for sweats, her blonde bob unstyled and limp. One guy swore he'd seen her loading boxes into a U-Haul, and I couldn't help but hope it was true. My land was mine again, and her absence felt like the final trophy in a war I hadn't started but damn sure finished. Life slipped back into its old groove, the kind of quiet I'd almost forgotten. Mornings with coffee and cowbells, afternoons tweaking fences or riding Maverick, evenings with the dogs sprawled out, their snores a soundtrack to the sunset. The barn stood proud, no yoga mats or candles to defile it, just a working space smelling of hay and honest sweat, the way it was meant to be. The HOA, under new blood, sent a letter, formal, polite, apologizing for past misunderstandings, and confirming my property was off their books. No fines, no jurisdiction, a clean slate I framed and hung in the kitchen for kicks. Neighbors dropped by more often, less wary now, some bringing pie or beer, others just to chat about the weather or laugh about that time you chased the HOA with dogs. It was strange, being a local legend, but it beat being a punching bag for Eleanor's rules. Even the videos kept circulating, racking up comments like, "Hero," and "Wish I had those sprinklers," a petty legacy I didn't mind one bit. Then came the rumor. Eleanor had sold her house, a quick deal to some out-of-towner, and was gone by month's end, no goodbye, no last stand. Just a for sale sign and an empty driveway. I rode Maverick past her place one day, saw the blank windows, and felt a twinge. Not pity exactly, but something close, like watching a storm blow out after it's wreaked enough havoc. The new HOA head, a guy named Tom who'd always kept his head down, stopped by to confirm it. Moved to the city, I think. We're done with that nonsense. And I nodded, offering him a beer, both of us grinning at the peace that settled over the street. That night I sat on the porch, stars popping out one by one, Brutus snoring at my feet, and thought about how it had all started. A yoga class, a trespass, a fight I hadn't wanted but won anyway. The sprinklers hummed faintly, the cows lowed in the distance, and I raised my drink to the quiet, knowing I'd earned every damn second of it. Eleanor was a memory, her war lost, and my land, my rules, stood stronger than ever. The weeks after Eleanor's exit melted into a calm I hadn't known I'd missed. Mornings dawned with the sun creeping over the fields, coffee steaming as I watched from the porch. The only sounds the rustle of leaves and the occasional moo, no chance, or picket signs to sour the peace. My barn stood untouched, a fortress of hay and wood, its doors shut to anything but farm life. While Brutus, Fang, and Daisy roamed the yard, their barks a friendly echo instead of a battle cry. The neighborhood shed its tension like an old skin. Folks waved without glancing over their shoulders. The HOA's new crew kept meetings short and sane, and my mailbox stayed its unapproved shade of green, a quiet rebellion no one dared fine. It was victory, hard-won and sweet, and every time I rode Maverick past Alina's empty house, its windows dark and lawn overgrown, I felt the weight of her absence like a metal pin to my chest. A war started over yoga mats, ended with a horse and a loophole, and I'd come out with my land and my sanity intact. The dogs sprawled at my feet each night, the sprinklers gleamed in the moonlight, and I'd grin knowing I'd turned her game against her and won more than just a barn. Life didn't just go back to normal, it got better. Neighbors I'd barely spoken to before turned into allies, dropping off casseroles or stopping to chat about crops, their kids sneaking peeks at the famous barn, while whispering about the videos still bouncing around online, a legacy of chaos that made me chuckle when I checked the views. The HOA sent one last letter, a formal deed clarification proving my property was mine alone, no community list nonsense, and I hung it beside the apology, a pair of trophies from a fight I hadn't picked but finished. Tom, the new head, became a regular, swapping stories over beers about Alina's reign, how she'd once fined him for a birdhouse too rustic, and we'd laugh, the absurdity bonding us in a way her rules never could. Even the county inspector swung by once, not for trouble but curiosity, eyeing the sprinklers and muttering, "Smart setup," before tipping his hat and leaving. My land wasn't just free, it was respected, a line no one crossed without a nod my way. One evening, as the sun dipped low, painting the sky in streaks of gold and purple, I sat with a cold drink, the dogs snoring in a pile, and let the quiet sink in. No fines in the mail, no yoga cult in my barn, just the hum of crickets and the creak of the porch swing. I thought about Alina, probably stewing in some city condo, her power trip a memory she couldn't rewrite, and wondered if she'd ever admit she'd lost to a guy with a horse and some wet grass. The videos still popped up in my feed, HOA versus security system hitting 1 million views, and I'd watch, laughing at the chaos that set me free. A reminder that sometimes you fight petty with petty and come out on top. The barn loomed in the dusk, solid and mine. The sprinklers glinted like sentinels, and I raised my glass to the stars. Peace at last, not just for now, but for good, because I'd made damn sure of it. Brutus stirred, nudging my hand, and I scratched his ears, grinning at the life I'd carved out. Land, dogs, and a story no one in this county would forget.